They said they could hire 3 juniors for what they paid me, he sneered as I sank into the chair across from my soon-to-be former boss. Nothing personal, just budget cuts. My name is Marcus Reed. I'm 57 years old, and for the past 17 years, I was the senior solutions architect at North Point Realty. I designed their entire IT backbone from the ground up, planned every upgrade, and kept the system so flawless that the C-suite stopped realizing how deeply their operations depended on me until the day they decided I was too costly to keep around. Across the table sat Ethan Monroe, the freshly minted chief technology officer who had been with North Point for a mere half year. At 40, his designer frames and Cornell MBA were more impressive on paper than in practice. He'd been parachuted in to modernize the department, which, as it turned out, meant letting go of the folks who actually knew how things worked. Sandra, Ethan gestured to the human resources manager beside him. She offered me a sterile smile before sliding a manila envelope toward me. Your severance package. 2 months pay plus accrued vacation time. I took the folder without a word. Is that it? I asked, meeting his eyes evenly. Ethan's lips curled into a patronizing grin. What else is there to say? We appreciate your cooperation during the transition. What would you like me to say? I shrugged. Most people in my shoes have questions or concerns. Sandra exchanged a puzzled look with Ethan. My composure apparently unnerved them. But calm doesn't always mean contentment. Inside, I was raging. Ethan cleared his throat. We'll need your assistance for a brief handover. The new engineering crew will want guidance on the architecture. Maybe we can discuss a short-term consulting arrangement. I'll consider it, I replied, though I knew I wouldn't lift a finger to help these interlopers. We shook hands, and I left them to wonder why I hadn't demanded more. Gathering my few belongings, I packed 17 years of work into a single cardboard box. Colleagues avoided eye contact as I passed, unwilling to acknowledge their own precarious positions. At the parking garage, my phone vibrated. A text from Carl, our database guru whom I'd hired a dozen years ago, blinking on the screen. Reed, this is Carr. Team's in chaos. You got the memo? I stared at the message, but didn't respond. Later, on the deck overlooking Lake Michigan, I sat alone with a neat pour of rye whiskey. The autumn sun, a molten orb, shimmered across the water's expanse. My wife, Sophia, placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. What comes next? She asked softly. I took a slow sip and exhaled. Something will turn up, I replied, though uncertainty gnawed at me. What Ethan and the board didn't understand was that my involvement went far deeper than the strategic blueprints they'd reviewed. I was the one who had personally written much of the code, carefully weaving in redundant processes, hidden firewalls, and proprietary networking frameworks, most of which lacked comprehensive documentation because North Point had always balked at hiring a proper tech writer team. Only I had the full grasp of these substructures, and I intended to keep it that way. I joined North Point back when it was still Baywater Properties, a modest real estate management outfit overseeing just 3 apartment buildings and barely a dozen employees. Their IT department had consisted of 2 battered desktops, a clunky fax machine, and a dial-up modem. Harold Bay, the company's founder, had plucked me from a consulting job in Chicago with a simple promise. We're growing fast. We need a robust system. Over the years, piece by piece, I transformed that rudimentary setup into a seamless property management network, from automated tenant screenings and digital lease signing to maintenance request portals and online rent collection. By the time the private equity group swooped in 5 years ago, rebranding us as North Point Realty, I managed 62 properties across 3 states, all running on the infrastructure I'd conceived and nurtured. For a time, they acknowledged my value. But once Harold retired, the new owner sought quarterly returns above anything else. My pitch for a dedicated documentation and training team was dismissed as too costly. Let's revisit next quarter. That quarter never arrived. Instead, bean-counting consultants and MBAs roamed our offices, espousing disruptive cloud solutions that clashed spectacularly with our bespoke architecture. They glanced blankly when I tried to explain the intricate fail-safes and bespoke encryption layers I'd integrated, then recommended generic SaaS packages that would shatter our ecosystem. I pushed back, pointing out how essential our custom framework was, only to be excluded from future strategy sessions. Sophia had warned me first. One evening, As we shared a late dinner under dim kitchen lights, she observed, "They're sidestepping you, Marcus. They're engineering your exit." I shook my head, convinced that any enterprise as complex as North Point needed me. Who else can untangle this knot if something blows up? I had argued, yet here I was, escorted out like yesterday's news. Sophia's hand squeezed mine, but worry clouded her eyes. "You need a plan," she said. I forced a wry smile. "I'll figure something out. Always have." But underneath, I understood that while they might replace me on the payroll with multiple rookies, they could never replicate the institutional knowledge I controlled. And I had no intention of teaching them how to do it. 6 months earlier, everything began to unravel. Sophia leaned forward at the kitchen table, concern etched on her face. "Is that the core issue?" she asked quietly, her eyes fixed on me. "You know they brought Ethan on board as CTO half a year ago." I nodded, swirling the coffee in my mug. Ethan Monroe came from a banking software firm and immediately started preaching about standardizing everything and replacing legacy systems. He'd recruited 3 fresh graduates straight out of college, bright-eyed and enthusiastic, then had them shadow me at work, peppering me with questions about every nook of our infrastructure. I answered as best I could, but I knew they weren't internalizing the complexity. After all, it had taken me a decade to weave those interlocking redundancies, the self-healing routines, and the hidden security protocols that kept North Point Realty humming along when servers glitched or data streams hiccuped. Then came the day I should have anticipated. Just 2 weeks after they'd shown me the door, my phone buzzed while I was updating my resume in my home office. "Unknown caller," it read. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Ethan. "Marcus, this is Ethan. We're encountering issues with the tenant portal. My junior team is on it, but they're struggling to untangle your code. Could you call me back? It'll be a quick consult." I deleted the voicemail without a second thought and went back to polishing my resume. But more messages followed, 3 more calls that afternoon, each one tinged with rising panic. By evening, a text arrived from Carl, our database admin. "Marcus, systems are toasted. Maintenance queue is down, urgent." My stomach tightened. I said nothing. The following morning, the HR director, Sandra, called. "Marcus, I hope you're well. We'd like to talk about a consulting arrangement, temporary, just to help us address some critical system faults. Compensation will be generous." I pressed the phone against my ear, my mind already made up. "How generous?" I asked, voice steady. $500 an hour, 4-hour minimum." I paused. "I'll consider it." I lied and hung up. Sophia set a fresh cup of coffee in front of me just then. "What's on your mind?" she asked, wrapping her arms around me. The chilly window pane behind her framed the still waters of Lake Michigan. "I'm realizing they're finally seeing what I've been worth all along." Over the next 3 days, the calls came like clockwork. Ethan, Sandra, even Justin Baywater, who still sat on the board, demanded my time. The tenant portal was glitching, maintenance requests thrown into chaos, and automatic rent collections failing to process for hundreds of residents. Yet I didn't respond. On the 4th morning, I opened my email to find a message from Cedarbrook Systems, a regional rival to North Point Realty. They managed fewer properties, but had grown rapidly over the last 2 years. The subject line read, "Opportunity at Cedarbrook Systems." Inside, their director of technology, Lawrence Delson, wrote, "Marcus, I've heard about your situation at North Point. We've long admired your work. If you're open, we'd like to discuss opportunities here. We're aiming for a full overhaul of our property management infrastructure." I replied immediately, and we set a meeting for the next day. That evening, as Sophia and I prepared dinner, the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Ethan Monroe standing on our porch, his meticulously tailored suit creased at the elbows, his hair slightly mussed, uncharacteristic for someone who always looked so polished. He cleared his throat. "Marcus, sorry to drop by unannounced, but we're in crisis mode. The system is completely paralyzed. Nothing is working. My team can't figure out the root cause or the fix." I leaned against the door jamb, arms folded. "Sounds serious." "It is," he said with a desperation I hadn't heard before. "The board has authorized a substantial consulting fee, $500 an hour, whatever it takes." I consider the cardboard box in my garage, the box that held 17 years of my life reduced to a few folders, personal photos and branded mugs. I thought of Ethan's earlier words, nothing personal, just budget cuts. I thought of my repeated pleas for a proper documentation team that were always dismissed. I'm sorry to hear you're in this mess, I said softly, but I have an interview tomorrow morning. I'll pass. With that, I shut the door gently and returned to the kitchen. For the first time since they'd shown me the exit, a sense of calm settled over me. Not vengeance, not triumph, but clarity. I wouldn't be the guy to bail them out. The next day's meeting with Lawrence, Dell's son, went better than I dared hope. We sat in a quiet corner of a coffee shop in downtown Chicago, far from the prying eyes of both North Point and Cedarbrook's offices. He leaned forward across the small table, stirring his cappuccino. Marcus, I've followed your work for years. The system you built at North Point is legendary. No one else in the region has anything close to its capabilities. Thank you, I said, letting his praise sink in. It took years to build it, right? That's exactly why I want to talk about time, Lawrence continued. We want to create something similar, something even more robust. We don't want to start from scratch, and we need someone who understands deep integration, redundant fail-safes, security layers, and seamless scaling. We need that expertise from day one. I leaned back, considering the offer. I'm interested, I said slowly. Lawrence's face broke into a grin. Excellent. I want to extend an offer. Chief Systems Architect at Cedarbrook. Full benefits, stock options, and a salary 20% higher than you made at North Point. I let that sink in. It was generous, almost too generous. Why me? I asked, folding my hands. You could hire younger engineers. Surely you could find talent willing to work at a lower rate. Lawrence met my gaze evenly. Because building a system of this complexity from scratch would take years. You already know how to integrate disparate services, design for redundancy, and keep things running under load. You're not just another engineer. You're the one person we trust to guide this from conception to completion. I nodded slowly. That evening, as Sophia and I walked along the lakefront, the first crisp autumn winds whistling around us, I finally allowed myself to believe that something would turn up. Not because I had to save a company that failed to appreciate me, but because I could start fresh, on my own terms, with a team and resources rather than constant headwinds. Meanwhile, at North Point, Ethan Monroe and his trio of graduates scrambled to piece together the chaos I'd left behind, offering ever higher consulting rates to lure me back. But I had made my choice. It was time to step into a new role where my knowledge was valued, where legacy code wasn't vilified but embraced, and where a proper documentation team was a given, rather than an empty promise. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, painting the lake in streaks of gold and crimson, I felt no bitterness for North Point's loss. I felt ready. Lawrence laughed, a hint of amusement in his eyes. You sound just like your former employer. We tried that route first. We hired 3 bright young engineers fresh out of top schools. They built us something sleek and modern, but ask it to handle more than 100 concurrent users, and it crashes like dominoes. We don't need cheap. We need something we can truly rely on. The next day, I accepted the offer. Meanwhile, North Point's problems continued to spiral. Carl kept me updated through sporadic texts. The system had been partially restored, but critical functions were still failing. They'd hired an expensive consulting firm specializing in legacy system recovery, yet stability remained elusive. A week after I arrived at Cedarbrook, my phone rang. It was Ethan. Marcus, please, this is getting serious. We've lost access to payment records for the past 3 months. Tenants are complaining about incorrect charges. The consultants say they need your input on the database schema. I was tempted to ignore him, but I answered, Ethan, I'm employed now. I have an exclusive contract. I can't help you. We'll double whatever they're paying you for just 2 days of work, he insisted. My voice remained controlled. It's not about the money. So is it revenge? Are you enjoying watching us struggle? He shot back. I paused, weighing each word. No, Ethan, I'm not enjoying it. But you and the rest of the board made a business decision. You determined my expertise was an unnecessary expense. Now you're discovering what that actually means in practice. He hesitated. The board wants to discuss bringing you back. Full salary plus a signing bonus. For a moment, a flicker of satisfaction crossed my mind. Then it died away. Going back wouldn't solve anything. The same executives who deemed me expendable would be ready to cut costs again at the first opportunity. I inhaled deeply and replied, I appreciate the offer, but my commitment is now to Cedarbrook. Ethan's voice hardened. You know there could be legal implications if we discover you intentionally made our systems nearly impossible to maintain. Non-compete clauses, intellectual property concerns. Every line of code I wrote belongs to North Point, as specified in my contract. I shot back, my tone cold. I didn't take anything with me except my expertise, but feel free to have your lawyers contact mine. I hung up, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the anger I'd only now allowed myself to feel. The accusation that I'd sabotaged them was the final insult. At Cedarbrook, I threw myself into a completely new routine. We built systems brick by brick, this time with proper documentation, training programs for the engineering team, and redundancies that would prevent the kind of disaster North Point was enduring. I wouldn't look back, but I also wouldn't help those who had neglected me. Some lessons must be learned the hard way. About a month after joining the team, I received an unexpected visitor in my modest office. Carl, my former database administrator. Got time for lunch? He appeared in the doorway, a well-worn backpack slung over his shoulder. Sandwiches at that deli we used to hit. Curious, I agreed. While we grabbed wraps in a bustling corner of the restaurant, he spoke in a low voice. The situation at North Point is even worse than I imagined. They've lost access to nearly 3 years of historical data. The backups, they're corrupted. The consultants are saying they might have to rebuild from scratch. I murmured, makes sense, given the redundancies and security protocols I put in place. Skip a single step in the restoration process, and everything shuts down to protect tenant data. Without following the exact procedure, the system self-destructs. That's not all, Carl continued. I found something while trying to help the consultants understand the payment system. He opened his laptop and showed me a series of emails he'd uncovered in the system archives. Ethan had been planning your termination for months. He was meeting with the board, convincing them that your custom infrastructure was too expensive to maintain. According to him, they could replace you with cheaper engineers and migrate to off-the-shelf solutions within 6 months, saving over $1 million annually. I read through the messages, feeling a strange detachment. One line from Ethan stood out. Marcus's custom systems are unnecessarily complex. He made himself indispensable by design, not necessity. Carl sighed and added, also, the private equity firm that owns North Point is planning to sell. They've been prepping for this deal for over a year. Ethan's role was to cut costs to clean up the books before the sale. Now it all makes sense. The push for standardization, the resistance to proper documentation, the sudden focus on cutting senior staff. It wasn't about improving the company, but about inflating profit margins for a quick flip. I asked, why are you showing me this? Carl closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. Because I quit yesterday. And I'm not the only one. Half the IT department has left. The consultants estimate it will take at least 6 months to restore full functionality, maybe longer. He paused. And North Point's largest client, Crestwood Properties, is considering jumping ship. They've lost faith in the management system. That contract represents nearly 30% of North Point's revenue. Losing them would be devastating, especially with the sale pending. I considered the implications. What will you do now? Carl offered a crooked grin. Actually, I was wondering whether you guys at Cedarbrook are hiring DBAs. Later that afternoon, I called Lawrence Delson and recommended bringing Carl onto our team. He agreed immediately. We were now building a solid team, people who understood what it meant to create systems designed to last. That evening, I received another call from Ethan. This time, his voice sounded drained. Marcus, please. The situation is critical. Crestwood is threatening to terminate their contract. The board is questioning my decisions. I couldn't help but smile as I watched the sunset's reflection on the large window of my office. I wouldn't say a word. Any advice or explanation would simply prove that overlooking the expertise of the person who'd built everything was far costlier than they'd ever imagined. Closing my eyes, I took a deep breath and returned to work at Cedarbrook, where my future, at least, depended on valuing every detail I had brought with me. They need your help. The words came through the line, heavy with desperation. I closed the office door behind me and let the silence fill the gap. I'm sorry, Ethan, I said quietly, but I can't help you. Name your price, he countered. It's not about money, I replied. It's about respecting the effort that goes into building something right the first time. A long pause. Finally, Ethan said, You knew this would happen. Exactly what would break and when. No, Ethan, I said. I only knew what I built and what it took to maintain it. Information I try to share many times. I hung up without a trace of triumph or regret, merely that quiet certainty that some lessons can only be learned through failure. 2 months into my role at Cedarbrook Systems, Lawrence called me into his corner office without warning. He closed the door behind me and gestured to a chair. I just spoke with Jeffrey Carlisle, he said, referring to the CEO of Carlisle Properties, our largest prospective client. They're officially terminating their contract with North Point next month. They want to know if Cedarbrook can handle their portfolio. Carlisle Properties oversaw more than 8,500 units across the Midwest, more than doubling Cedarbrook's current operations. I leaned forward, letting the weight of that sink in. We're not prepared for that scale yet, I admitted. The new platform is only halfway complete. Lawrence frowned. What would it take to be ready if we had to? I took a moment, picturing the architecture in my mind. We'd need at least 3 more senior engineers, dedicated servers, and roughly 8 weeks of focused development. Even then, it would be tight. Jeffrey Carlisle's tone had been urgent. North Point's failures were now tainting Carlisle Properties' reputation among tenants. He'd offered us 12 weeks and committed to funding the entire hardware expansion. This was it, the turning point. If Cedarbrook could successfully onboard Carlisle Properties, we'd instantly become a major player. If we failed, both companies would be in serious jeopardy. Give me a day to draft a plan, I said. That night, I barely slept. I sketched network diagrams on paper plates, mapped database migrations with a red Sharpie, and ran simulations in my head of peak load scenarios. By sunrise, I had a blueprint, a staged approach that would migrate properties in batches, ensuring each region came online without overwhelming our new architecture. When I presented it to Lawrence, he scrutinized every detail. This is solid, he said at last, but you've allocated 3 weeks just for documentation. It's non-negotiable, I replied. This is where North Point failed. We document thoroughly from day one, train every team member on each module, and eliminate single points of failure. Lawrence nodded slowly. I trust you. Let's proceed. The following weeks were a whirlwind. We hired 5 new engineers, 2 of whom had recently walked out of North Point in frustration. Carl built a custom migration tool to translate North Point's legacy schema into our new database structure, while I finalized a modular, horizontally scalable design tailored for Carlisle's anticipated growth. 10 weeks into our 12-week timeline, we were ready for the first cutover. Carlisle's smallest region, comprising 1,800 units around Des Moines. If it succeeded, the rest would follow. The evening before go-live, Lawrence summoned me again. Seated across from him was Jeffrey Carlisle in a crisp suit, his presence both formal and sincere. So you're the system architect, Jeffrey said, rising to shake my hand. Lawrence has spoken highly of you. I understand you built this with resilience in mind. That's the plan, I said, returning his handshake. And yes, I used to work for North Point. Jeffrey's expression tightened. They're in dire straits. Equity owners are desperate to sell, but with Carlisle Properties walking away and their systems still malfunctioning, there are few suitors. I nodded, understanding the subtext. Jeffrey continued, One potential buyer is Cedarbrook, interested in acquiring North Point at a steep discount compared to 6 months ago. I looked between them, absorbing the gravity of what he'd said. If Cedarbrook acquired North Point, I would be in the unique position of integrating 2 massive legacy systems, both of which I knew intimately. Are you asking if I'd be willing to lead that integration? I asked. Lawrence nodded. Only if the acquisition goes through, and only if you're open to it. I considered the irony. The very system I had built, once cast aside by executives who didn't grasp its value, was now potentially coming back under my stewardship. I'd be willing, I said at last. But on one condition, we do it right. Full documentation, rigorous training, no half measures. Agreed, Lawrence replied firmly. We've learned from their mistakes. 6 months later, I stood in the sleek lobby of what had once been North Point Realty's headquarters. The polished sign now read Cedarbrook Integrated Property Management. Together, we had finalized the acquisition at less than a quarter of North Point's previous valuation. Lawrence and I walked the corridors, greeting former North Point employees who, after some hesitation, were staying on to ensure a smooth transition. Some avoided our eyes. Others offered relieved smiles. A handful, those who had worked alongside me for years, nodded with quiet respect. Ethan Monroe was long gone, as was most of the executive team responsible for my termination. Justin Baywater, the former owner's son, had remained as a consultant to help preserve client relationships. When we reached the glass-enclosed server room, my old domain, I paused. Through the tempered glass, the racks gleamed under new lighting. Hardware I had originally specified, its firmware updated, components reconfigured. "Want to take a peek inside?" Lawrence asked. "No need," I replied. "We'll be decommissioning this and migrating entirely to our new infrastructure." In the main conference room, the remaining North Point staff assembled for the formal announcement. Lawrence introduced me as Chief Integration Officer. Many of you recognize Marcus. He built the original systems for North Point nearly 2 decades ago. Now, he'll guide us in merging both companies' technologies into something stronger than either had before. As I glanced over the faces, some familiar, some new, I felt none of the triumph or gloating I might have expected. What purpose would there be? Instead, I spoke briefly about our unified roadmap, the migration schedule, and the support structure in place for every team member. I reassured them that no one would be left behind due to cost-cutting measures, an ironic note, given my own history there. 1 year after the acquisition, Cedarbrook Integrated Property Management had become the largest property management firm in the Midwest. All 10,000-plus units were now running on the unified platform I had designed. Fully documented, comprehensively staffed, and operating with the reliability North Point had never achieved. On a crisp autumn morning, just as the maple trees along Lake Michigan's shore erupted into fiery reds and golds, I drove to the office for a final meeting with Lawrence. The air was sharp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke. "The board approved your proposal," Lawrence said as I took my seat. "The technical training division launches next quarter. You'll have full autonomy to design the curriculum and hire instructors." That had been my request for staying on after integration. Not a higher salary or grander title, but the creation of a division dedicated to training the next generation of systems engineers and architects, teaching them not only to code, but to build systems meant to endure. "Thank you," I said, meaning it. "No," Lawrence corrected me, voice warm. "Thank you. What you built here is remarkable. Not just the technology, but the culture, the documentation ethos, the emphasis on quality over quick fixes." Later that afternoon, I cleared out my integration office. Unlike the hurried exit from North Point, this was a planned transition into my new role. As I packed personal items into cardboard boxes, Justin Baywater knocked and stepped inside. "Got a minute?" he asked. We walked to the courtyard outside, where a few oak leaves had already started to fall. "My father still talks about you," Justin said, glancing back at the building. "He's retired down in Florida now, but he follows the news. He was pleased to hear you came back, in a sense." "How is Harold?" I asked, referring to his father, the original founder of North Point. "Good. He's taken up fishing, says it's peaceful." Justin paused, searching for words. "He always said letting you go would be the biggest mistake North Point ever made. Turns out he was right." I nodded, at a loss for what to say. Justin smiled ruefully. "I learned something from all this. Sometimes, value isn't visible until it's gone." As I drove home along the lakeshore, crisp breeze tossing my collar, I reflected on value. The worth of experience, the care invested in doing things properly from the start, the systems designed to last. I hadn't sought revenge. I hadn't needed it. I'd simply moved forward, building something better, something that would outlast any short-sighted decision. Sometimes the best response to being undervalued is to prove your worth elsewhere and let the results speak for themselves.